So what I'm going to do today is go over sort of the state of wind in the world, wind power in the world, what's happening, show you some pretty pictures, and hopefully answer your questions and point you in the direction of some resources if you need that as well. We're going to be looking at some of sort of the typical examples. We'll provide context of what's happening in the world at this point, the typical examples of Germany, Denmark, some from the UK, and then bring it back home to Canada, Ontario, and then more specifically community power and what we're doing with Pukwes. So, wind is growing quickly. Just in terms of installed capacity, wind is growing very, very quickly. The world's fastest growing energy source, and you can see the level of growth there from, in just over a decade, 15 years, it's gone up 38 times in terms of installed capacity. So it's pretty amazing, and it's, as you'll see, it's due in part to, there's some of the traditional countries, like the US and Germany have been strong in wind for quite a long time. Then countries like China, Spain, and India have been really coming up lately. And they're putting up a massive amount of wind, especially China. Basically, in terms of actual, penetration on the grid and how much electricity different countries are getting from wind, Denmark is still the leader in that. They're getting around 20% from wind. And that's, that's something historically they've been one of the leaders. They're a small country, so they're not going to ever be at the top again, but they're still one of the top countries in terms of the technology and exporting the technology with, companies like Vestas, known worldwide for their technology, exporting thousands of turbines and producing them in other places around the world as well. So Germany, in some areas it's 50%, but obviously Germany is a lot larger, so wind, they don't have the same penetration there, but they're working on offshore wind. Germany's just getting into that more recently. Denmark's been doing that for a little longer, but as some of the good sites on land are being used up, they're going offshore to do larger projects there. And then basically what we can see now is a real sort of spreading out of wind across the world. These figures are from 2009, but there's 16 countries that have over 1,000 megawatts of wind power capacity. So basically what we're talking about with these guys, they'd be 2 megawatts each per turbine. So that would be 500 of those. So it's fairly considerable, and some of these are fairly small countries. Even countries like Portugal are really coming up. So this, it doesn't look as good as the other graphic, but it's more current. China just recently passed Germany, not so long ago. So you can see that China is just the juggernaut in terms of wind. A lot of people obviously talk about China and the problems in terms of, fossil fuels and coal and use like that, but China, I think in the sense, they can move more quickly. They have more pollution problems than we do. They have more congestion problems than we do. So in a sense, they get it. And they're moving ahead with green technologies, with efficiency, with conservation. They have to move ahead on all of these. They're also moving ahead on nuclear and coal and gas, but really they have to move on everything because they need so much energy at this point. So China is the leader, or will be the leader soon if they are not already. And certainly they're going to be the leader for many years to come, I would imagine. If you look down the list, Spain has kind of slackened a bit. They were one of the leaders, but as often happens in Europe, there's some regulatory changes, and then you just don't get as many wind turbines coming in. That was one of the key things in Denmark. Denmark has slowed considerably, and a lot of that was to do up to about 2000. They were one of the leading jurisdictions, but then there were some changes in government, and it's just a fairly small country, so they're getting built out. But if you look below, I don't have it listed here, but Canada, at the end of 2009, was in the 11th spot. And I would imagine by the end of last year that Canada would have eclipsed Denmark, because, as I'll show later, Canada's over 4,000 megawatts now, and Denmark is not adding capacity very quickly. So Canada, the next time you see this chart, Canada will be in the 10th spot, which is exciting for us, but there's still a long way to go. Because the idea with Denmark is they don't have a lot of domestic resources in terms of coal and fossil fuel, especially people on the coast and around the islands, and used to being quite self-sufficient. They came together to look for a solution, and the way in which they decided to do that was through wind turbines, and specifically doing smaller projects, locally owned, locally developed, with the benefit, being local as well. So that's the way they were able to build up their industry. And it started with the farmers, it started with the villagers, and it led to a huge industry now, which exports products all over the world, which employs thousands of Danes and brings a lot of revenue into the country as well. And so this is one of those things that they wanted to really promote energy independence. They wanted to make sure that they weren't at the mercy of the vagaries of the oil market anymore. Obviously they're still, they're not off fossil fuels in Denmark, but this has made a big contribution to their grid, and it's something that with their interconnections with the other Scandinavian countries and other parts of Europe, they can actually balance it off the times where they have too much wind energy. They can balance it off with some of the hydro resources in the other countries, and they have other sources to provide when the wind isn't blowing. They can also import electricity as well. So basically it was a really grassroots movement. It's sort of different from what we've seen in Ontario. I guess there's goods and bads in that. It took a while to develop, but now that it's developed, people understand wind, people are comfortable with wind in Denmark, and people, there's not as many problems as we see here with it, just in terms of people accepting wind power. And another point, this is kind of an interesting thing for me, is that wind is more prevalent at night and during the winter. So, and that's not generally the peak use times for electricity generally. So what the Danes are looking at is electrifying their sort of transportation network. They want to really aggressively go after deployment of electric vehicles so that these electric vehicles can be charging at night and use up this excess capacity, this excess wind capacity. So it makes more economic sense for them to do that than to transport it elsewhere. And so they're one of, you guys have heard of Better Place. It's a scheme founded by a former software pioneer essentially, and the whole idea is to sell mobility instead of transportation. Instead of a vehicle, you're selling the service of mobility. It's like having a cell phone. People want to be able to communicate, but they don't really care. It's not the phone they want the service. So changing that model and applying it to basically vehicles. And so the vehicles would be electric. They would be able to use the wind power as long as you regulate the charging. And I'm sure transportation is going to be talked about more, but that's one way Denmark's looking to use this wind capacity, this resource that's more plentiful at these times and sometimes in excess. So this is not a great picture, but it basically shows you that there's a shoal which is called Middelgrunden, and for quite a bit of time they used to dump construction waste there. So it was not the most ecologically productive area, but they decided to do something different because it's a fairly shallow area. It's close, this is the city center of Denmark, it's Copenhagen, excuse me. It's close to the city center, so they thought, why don't we build a wind project there? And they, being a local office of the government of Copenhagen, their environment office, they got together with a group of citizens. The citizens came up with a co-op, about 10,000 of them eventually invested in the wind project. So, and the wind project is, which I'll show you in a sec, is jointly owned by this cooperative, the Citizens Cooperative, and the local utility, which is now a larger utility. So I've got this picture here, which is better. The Danes are very used to this, and basically in Copenhagen, when the wind turbines are going, they know that there's good wind, so that's when the boats go out, right? And so it's not an issue. They're very much used to it, and you can't see it in this picture, but if you go across the bridge linking Sweden to Denmark, the Øresund Bridge, there's also a number of other projects. This one was designed, you can't get a great picture of it because it only shows the two wind turbines, but this one was designed in such a way that it's in an arc, so it makes it more visually pleasing. And it's become an iconic project which people pay to go see. There's lots of tugboats that go out, people take pictures, and people have been learning about this model since 2000. It's been up for 10 years now, and it's still functioning well, and this model has been something that we're trying to replicate over here as well. Okay, so this gives you a better idea of the sort of the way the project looks, and it's quite graceful looking to my eyes anyways. And it's something that the cooperative actually owns 10 of the turbines, and the utility owns the other 10. So it's the kind of project that it's a lot of money to build something like this, so it makes sense to have partners. And you don't really have to have 100% community ownership, though in this sense it is a municipally owned utility, so it is in that sense 100% owned, but it's a great thing to bring on partners And for municipalities, it really makes sense for them to bring their citizens in because you get more buy-in for the projects and they're easier to build. As you can see, people are kayaking near the project, no problem. And even there's been some, I believe, talk of fish using some of the foundations as artificial reefs and things like that. In terms of Germany, Germany is the other main model that we're looking at. And why that is because they pioneered what's called a feed-in tariff law, which basically gives people the right to sell their electricity back to the grid for a fixed price over a fixed term contract. So it gives a cost certainty to producers, and it allows regular people, community groups, community centers, places of work, farmers, what have you, to actually access the grid. Whereas before it was only a one-way relationship with the grid, now it's actually a two-way relationship, and people can be producers as well as consumers, which is kind of a very neat thing. And it was envisioned as a job stimulus as well. And now the German renewable energy industry, and wind being a major part of that, employs almost as many people as the German automotive industry.
So is it too late for us, given the technology and the intelligence manufacturing wise of Denmark and Germany, to do the conversions of Detroit and take our dead automotive industry and flip into?
No, I wouldn't say it's too late. In terms of actually controlling the companies who produce the technology, we're playing catch up. But there's no reason why domestic industry can't happen. And one of the main things sort of supporting this, I guess, especially in Ontario, is the Green Energy and Green Economy Act. And so as a part of that, to sign a contract like we've done with the government of Ontario, you need to have a certain amount of domestic content. So locally produced parts, local labor, things like that. So that's leading to these firms having to set up shop in Ontario on both the wind and solar side. So you're getting the firms setting up shop here. They're not necessarily Canadian owned. There is a Canadian wind turbine manufacturing company. I think they're out of Montreal. So there's possibilities that we'll see more Canadian made by Canadian companies, actual turbines in the future. But right now the push is really just to get sort of the scale up and get an industry going in Ontario and Canada more generally, so that people will see that it's a worthwhile market to invest in, and for domestic investors that it's something worthwhile to get into as well. So we're not there yet, but there's positive signs definitely. Yeah, so basically, as you can see, there's quite big numbers in Germany in terms of the reductions in emissions. But beyond that, it's something that's kind of gone beyond politics in Germany now. The major parties support it. They might quibble over implementation and over pricing and the specific policies, but generally the whole idea of renewable energy and this being a good thing for Germany and Germany's economy specifically is kind of understood. We're not there yet. I would love to see us get to that point, but that's going to take some time. The UK, it's been a little different. They don't have as much capacity installed yet. They have a lot of capacity in terms of resource, and Scotland especially is a very windy spot. I'll talk a little bit about one Scottish project. So there's a lot of possibilities for them to get more energy independence. They've been looking at some big offshore projects there. At this point they have just around 5 gigawatts, which equals 5,000 megawatts. So it's a lot of wind, and they've been moving fairly quickly in recent months. They've installed 1,000 megawatts. This is, the data is a little old, but they installed 1,000 megawatts in just around a year. So it's impressive. And wind farms in the UK can power about 3 million homes there. Of course, the homes in the UK use a little less energy than the Canadian ones do, but still, it's an impressive. So very quickly, this is a project in Scotland. Basically what happened here, I read an article, and I was quite surprised to hear this, that local people found out that the project was coming in. Instead of starting a group to oppose the project, they asked the developer to sell them one of the turbines, to build an extra one that they would own, that they would get the revenue from. And the developer was probably surprised by this, but actually decided, okay, this is a good idea, let's go for it. And so far it's a win-win situation for the community and the developer. It's not a common story, and I would love to see more developers doing this in Ontario. Any developers doing this in Ontario, but it's something that we really advocate as a good way to get the community on side and a good way to raise the level of awareness about renewable energy generally. So Scotland has some very ambitious targets, but given their geography, it's pretty sparsely populated. They've got a lot of wind resources, they've got a lot of tidal wave resources, so it's something they could definitely do. They're looking to get to 80% renewables by 2020, and wind is going to play a big part of that. Okay, so I know it was a very sort of brief overview, but what, if any, lessons can you guys think of, or that you've heard of previously, could you draw from sort of the European experience, what that we could bring back here?
That people don't react to it as badly as you might think. That you hear a lot of people complaining about, I don't want that in my
Sure.
backyard,
Sure.
it's going to ruin my view. Like, especially along the eastern seaboard, there's a lot of people who have really expensive real estate that would probably oppose something like
The
that.
Cape Wind project, the
Right.
Kennedys were in opposition to that
Right.
one, yeah. Yeah, and I think part of it is that just the amount of time it took to develop the industry in Denmark, and I guess it wasn't even conceived of an industry really at that point. It was more conceived of just local economic development. So it happened, or local measures to become more energy independent. So that started sort of in the 70s and the 80s, and it slowly ramped up to the point where you have the larger wind turbines, and by this point people are more or less used to the technology. They've lived beside it, they know people who live beside it. Some of them are actually getting money from being part of the cooperatives or being part of a limited partnership or something that owns the turbines. So for them, it's not controversial anymore, but we've moved fairly quickly in Ontario. And the ownership, as you'll see later on, is not very much in the hands of the community, it's more in the hands of larger corporations, which is good and bad. Like, they can get the scale quite quickly, they can develop the projects, but as we've seen here, they're not as good getting the local buy-in, the public acceptance, and so that's something we're struggling with in Ontario.
How has the German, British, and Danish feedback been regarding the health issues then? Because there's a lot of controversy around it.
Yeah, there is a lot of controversy. Basically, in terms of the studies that we've seen, the literature we've examined, there's been nothing to show that the wind turbines are associated with the negative health impacts that some people in Ontario associate them with. One of the issues, I guess, that's been brought up is that if people have a negative perception of the project going into the project, they don't feel that they're part of it, they don't feel that they have a stake in it, that will predispose them to having some annoyance, and that annoyance could then lead to this or that. But generally, we've been looking at the literature, and it hasn't shown us anything in the experience of people living beside wind turbines for upwards of 20 years in some cases, hasn't shown us that there's a problem. So not to say that the people are faking, what they believe to be caused by the wind turbines, but we haven't seen that in the experience in other areas. Certainly have to properly site the wind farms, but we think the big reason, and you get a lot less opposition, is if they're actually locally owned and people feel like they're vested in the project.
Right.
But some areas, unfortunately, the well's been poisoned, and people can go to the airwaves with little information and little facts and create a lot of controversy and a lot of sort of emotional rhetoric that's not really based on the experience. So that's unfortunate, and it's something we're trying to counter with the work we do here. Yeah.
Now, I thought microwind is probably off the table because it's not really a viable technology, but it's appealing for a number of reasons.
Yeah, it's appealing, I guess, especially if you're in a sort of an off-grid application, if you have the room, but like anything, you don't want to, they have a term for it in the UK, they call it eco-bling, because people were strapping small wind turbines onto their homes, putting them maybe a few meters above their roof line, so they wouldn't really do anything. If they were turning, they could cause problems for the home itself,
Right.
being actually bolted onto the home. And they're just really costing you money. So there's some applications for it, but it's more of sort of the remote off-grid applications. And really with wind, the higher you can get it, the better. So you want to have a fairly high pole. To take from the Danish experience, it would be better if a few people got together to build a larger one to serve their neighborhood or their community. It would make a lot more sense in terms of financially, but in terms of the actual generation that you get out of it.
It seems that the people in Germany and Denmark and Britain were not really opposed to this. Were there education campaigns that kind of removed blinders? Because you know, there's talk about putting the wind turbines on Lake Ontario, right by the Scarborough Bluffs, and it was met with so much opposition, the marina, all this, it's gonna block the view. So how did the companies and the organizations that wanted to put these wind turbines overcome, and persuade the Europeans to be accepting of the wind?
Well, I think a lot of it was who was doing the persuading, and it was mostly like when your neighbor comes up to you and says, look, we're looking to do this wind project. You know, we've done our research, we think it's gonna be good for us, we think we can make a fair bit of money, we don't have to rely so much on oil, we can sell it back to the grid. It's a lot more convincing than a company coming to do a community meeting that they're mandated to do by the government and saying, look, this is a good project for you guys, don't worry about it, there'll be green energy. Can we invest in it? Well, no, not really, but it's good for the grid and it's, you know, good for the province and all of that. So if your neighbor, someone you know go to school with, someone from your place of worship comes up to you and says, look, we've got this idea, or you know, a bunch of farmers are thinking of this, you're much more likely to get involved than if someone you don't know, someone from outside of your community, is proposing something like this or is seen as imposing something like this on you. But it was incremental. I think that's the main thing in Denmark and Germany. It happened over time. It wasn't a rush. And they were smaller at the beginning because they developed the technology. The turbines are a lot less noisy now, they're safer, they're better technology, but they started getting used to those models, and then these ones are sort of light years ahead. So really they've become used to it over time. Like, change is not something that people like to do quickly all the time. And certainly a lot of people, especially in some of the rural areas in Ontario, especially the ones who move there and have second homes, expect it to be a certain way always. They don't expect it to be a working landscape. Farmers seem to get it a lot more than other people do. They understand that for them it's another crop. I was talking to some at the Erie Shores project down on Lake Erie, and for them it's kind of a no-brainer. It's, you know, one wind turbine, 50 acres, you get $5,000–10,000 a year depending on who you're going, depending on if they have a substation. It's just extra income for retirement, extra income for, you know, to help keep you on the farm. That makes sense to them. If someone's buying a property expecting it to be quiet, expecting it to be, you know, the view will stay the same forever, then that's another story. But in Europe it happened over time, right? So it's a little more quickly here, and I think definitely efforts could have been made to increase the acceptance, increase local ownership, but so that's why, you know, I want to talk to you guys about this, and that's why we're going to be talking to other people about this, because there's a different way to do these projects, and that's embodied by Puckwis. So in terms of Canada, it's still pretty small scale, less than 1%, or, you know, probably around 1% now of our electricity supply. Ontario's the leader at this point. Definitely within maybe 2013, 2014, we're going to be around that range. 12,000 megawatts of installed capacity. We're already over 4 now, and you'll see on one of the future slides we've got about 8,000 megawatts in the pipeline. So the industry is growing in leaps and bounds in Ontario and Canada. And CanWIA, which is the sort of industry association for wind in Canada, has a goal of 20% wind for Canada, 20% of Canada's electricity supply from wind by 2025, which is ambitious, but there's no reason we can't get there if we work at it. So you can see here, Ontario is the leader at close to, you know, 1.5 gigawatts, or 1,447 megawatts. Alberta historically has been the leader. They've got a really good wind resource there. One of the sort of main areas, Pincher Creek and those places like that, you'll see a lot of wind turbines there. Some of those old sort of pass sites, there's one in the States called Altamont Pass too. They're not the best demonstrations of wind power because they have a lot of small turbines, whereas now you have fewer larger turbines. So it's a less cluttered landscape. Some of those models weren't great, but Alberta is growing. Quebec has a lot in the pipeline as well, and over 600 megawatts already. And even tiny PEI has over 160 megawatts of wind power and some more in the pipeline. So it's definitely happening all over Ontario, or all over Canada, and it's great to see. And as we can see, more than 1 million Canadian homes can be powered by wind. So it's been quite a good growth, and it's nice to watch. So just gives you an idea more of what's in the pipeline here. You saw those numbers on the chart. This shows you what's in the offing. And Ontario, again, has a big, you know, the majority of the capacity almost is coming from Ontario, the planned capacity. A lot of that is coming from a deal that the government made with Samsung, which was quite controversial. But the whole idea behind that was to bring factories, to bring jobs to Ontario. So if that pans out, that alone would be about 2,000 megawatts. And so then the remainder is just over 2,000 megawatts. And this would be by 2016 in Ontario, though most of the projects would probably be done by 2012, 2013, in that time frame there. So as you can see, some provinces are lagging behind. There's a lot of potential on the prairies. There's certainly a lot of potential in places like BC, but they haven't quite gotten around it yet and really started to promote it. This is slightly old as well, but basically these are the main wind areas. You can see there's a pattern here, if people can notice it. By lakes, it's better. There's better wind coming off the lakes, there's less to get in the way. Our project, is up in this area here, but unfortunately Lake Simcoe didn't make the map. This is the closest large one to us, and it's a project in Shelburne. And that's the Melanchthon project, and it's quite a large project. There's been some controversy, but we drove the members of the First Nation, their chief and council, out to see the project, and it was basically a really misty day, so it wasn't maybe the best day for wind, but we got right beside where the turbines should have been. We couldn't see them, we couldn't hear anything, and so then we took them out again, and subsequently, so they could see and become comfortable with the technology. And it's a large project, but it's I guess a good sign of what you can do on the larger scale. But we're hoping that we could see a lot of smaller dots across the province that would be locally owned, so you don't have to have one 200 megawatt project. Instead, you could have 10 megawatt projects, or 10, 20 megawatt projects, because in terms of economic benefit locally, it's much better if you do it that way. I want to give you a little bit of an understanding, and we've talked about this to some extent already, what community power is or how we define it. We're really looking at our projects that are owned, developed, and controlled 50% or more by the local community, the people in which the projects are made. In Ontario, for the legislation, community is defined very broadly. I'm a community, you're a community. If you want to develop a project and you're resident in Ontario, you're a community. So there can be some abuse of that term, right? So what we're talking about is sort of a more broad look at community, but also focus. So your neighbors, people, but it could also bring together different communities to do a project. North, south communities, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, different stakeholders to do projects as well. And so this is a little old. This is from 2000, but this is kind of where things started to shift in Denmark and Germany. The Netherlands, again, they've kind of tapped out in terms of wind. They don't have that much more room. It's going to be offshore, whatever else they have, but they're not one of the leaders anymore. But as you can see, farmers, co-ops played a really significant role. In Germany, co-ops especially. In Denmark, again, it was the farmers who played a leading role. And then you get to Spain, and Spain is an entirely different situation. They have several large utilities who've now become wind powers. Gamesa, Iberdrola, and those guys go all over the world now, prospecting, in Ontario, throughout Canada, the US, to build projects. They just have a huge base of capital, and the problem is Spain does have more landmass than some of these countries, and also Spain, there's some areas that are very rural and there's not many people there, so they're able to do quite large projects in these sort of poor areas where people didn't really complain very much, and there was some benefit, but there wasn't many people there who could really invest in the projects. So Spain was developed in an entirely different way. It happened a little later, because obviously they had some different things going on in the 70s and 80s in Spain. If you see Minnesota, they have more of a kind of a communal model, but Minnesota, they basically had to try to be creative and take advantage of some incentives they had. And basically these incentives are mostly tax incentives. So if you're a big developer, it's easier to take advantage of those. And they've worked out models where the community would partner with these guys so that there'd be some community ownership. In Ontario, less than 1%. So we're certainly not there yet, but we're hopeful that more can happen. In terms of the benefits of local ownership, what we're talking about is more income, more economic activity, more jobs, and increase in local acceptance. And so this has been challenged, this idea, to some extent, but what we're talking about is more of a scenario where you really consciously try to source your labor, your capital locally. If you can do that, if you can hook up with your local credit union, there is the infrastructure in Ontario that you can do these projects the right way. And we're certainly trying to pioneer that and show people that that's the way to do it, and you can result in a huge amount of local economic development. So this is the X-Place turbine. which is owned by Windshare, 50% owned by Windshare and 50% owned by Toronto Hydro. Everyone uses this as an example. It's good in terms of a picture. It's not good in terms of a project that made money. There's only the one turbine. They had problems. Their manufacturer went out of business. It's like a perfect storm of bad things that can happen to a project. Great people. They've learned a lot and they moved the industry forward because of their hard work. But this isn't the way you want to do a project. They were initially envisioning more turbines. The Toronto Port Authority kind of put the kibosh on that, unfortunately. So it's great, especially as an educational tool. People can go there. There haven't been any problems. There's no noise complaints being right beside the highway. That was never really going to be an issue. So with this, it's a great landmark, but we want to move beyond that. And what we're looking at doing is what's called the Pukwis Community Wind Park Project. Pukwis means whirlwind in Ojibwa, so it's a sort of an apt term. There's a story behind that you can read on the website. I don't want to butcher the story. It's a neat tale. In any event, basically what we're looking at is a project that's being developed with the First Nation, obviously playing the lead role, and Windfall playing the lead development role. And our executive director has been working on this for almost 9 years now. And basically what we're talking about is something that would be 10 turbines, 20 megawatts, enough to power 7,500 homes. And yeah, something that really hasn't been done in Ontario or really anywhere else to date, just in terms of this level of collaboration between the Aboriginal community on this island and the broader communities, we like to call it. And basically this is Georgina Island. So if you go over to Highway 48 and up, that's basically how you get there. You've got to take a short ferry ride. At this point they have an ice road in. So they have some constraints in terms of transportation, but we're working around those. And so basically with this community, it's the island's about 1,200 hectares. It's a fairly good sized island. The northern part of the island, it's open land. It was used for farming, parts of it, but it's not really that good for that, so it's regenerating in meadow. So thankfully there's not as much cutting as you'd have to do on some other sites. So basically we're looking to put the turbines there so that they can be on the island, but far enough away that they won't impact on people's enjoyment of their homes. They can produce 53,000 megawatt hours per year. So it's a lot, and that's enough to power 7,500 homes. To put that in context, there's several hundred homes, including residences and seasonal residences on the island. So the island is going to be a renewable energy island, if you want to think of it that way. It's going to be an island that's up there with some of those islands in Denmark and other places, just in terms of the amount of renewable energy that's actually produced there. And so they're going to be providing a real big net benefit to the rest of Ontario. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about displaced, not reduced. We're talking about the emissions that would have had to have been produced from a different source. So by doing this, you don't have to get them from coal, you don't have to get them from natural gas. So basically, over 300,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions that will be displaced over the life of the project. So quite significant from a fairly modest sized project. The feed-in tariff contract, that was the key piece. If you don't have a contract with the government to sell the power, you can't get financing, you're really nowhere. So we secured that. That was a huge step forward. This is Brent, our executive director, smiling in his natural environment there. And then this is Chief and Council of the First Nation, Chief Donna Big Canoes in her 30s, very dynamic. It was actually her father who was kind of the visionary with Brent on this project, so she's continuing on along that path. So basically we've got the site, we've got the data, we've done our approvals, we're almost there, on all of those check boxes, and we're ready to begin construction later this year. And just in terms of what we're talking about, the numbers, it's a 20-year contract. The price paid will be 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and that's an additional 1.5 cents over and above the normal price. It's called the Aboriginal Adder. So that adds a considerable amount of money, 11% premium. That adds, I think we're talking about $8 or $9 million to the revenue of the project, and that basically makes up for the isolation of the island. So it makes it comparable to a mainland project, which is great. This is the Pukwis Energy Co-op, and basically that's going to be the part owner of the project, and they're going to be the ones who basically take in the money from the community. I'll show you how that works. We're looking at about a $3 or $6 million in that range offering, and that offering has to be approved by the Financial Services Commission of Ontario. So it's like an IPO, but less onerous. It can be something that can be done more at a local, more community level. You don't have to hire an investment bank to do it for you. thankfully. So in terms of what a cooperative is, it's basically a democratically controlled business enterprise. Members work together to achieve a common aim. And the key piece of that is one member, one vote. That's the way co-ops have always been set up. And it means that no matter how much equity you have in the co-op, you still have one vote like everyone else. It's hard for some people to sort of wrap their minds around, but it ensures like sort of democratic decision making, and it really ensures that, you know, people can feel comfortable and feel like they have a real say in what's happening. Basically, the co-op members in common, the co-op owns the turbines, revenue comes back from the sale of the electricity to the grid, and then depending on what the co-op wants to do, what its aims are, you pay dividends out to the members. So it's like having shares in that sense. They're just shares in a co-op. And again, the democratic decision-making process. So this is basically how it flows. You've got this happy group of people here who invest in the co-op. It's like, yay, we've got our own co-op, we're going to invest in the project. And they're working with what's called Pukwis Wind Partner 1 Inc., which is controlled by the Chippewa Georgian Island First Nation. They come together as a joint venture, buy, you know, build this project, operate the project, and reap the rewards in proportion to their investment. Everyone's happy. That's the theory. Just in terms of a really sort of brief idea of what the investment return, we're looking at this. This is a little bit old, but we can certainly, and you can see the disclaimer down here, what we're looking at is really we're going to have an offering statement that'll have all this information, give people an idea of the returns, and let people know sort of what they're getting into with any risks as well. So that's why I said it's kind of like an IP, but what we're looking at is a similar investment in terms of it's a low risk investment. We've taken as much risk out of it as possible, and so your return will be higher than what you'd get with a GIC. It's not like a tech stock, but then again your risk isn't there either. You're doing something in your community as well. So we're not expecting people to donate. This is an investment. The timeline, as I said, we're looking at probably spring 2011 for our offering. That has to go to the Financial Services Commission of Ontario for them to sign off on that. And then we're going to do a marketing drive. I'll be going out and others to communities throughout Ontario to really talk this project up, and also talk up the whole idea of doing projects like this, of course. Because, you know, if people don't feel comfortable investing in this, they're more than welcome to do something in their community, and we're helpful, you know, we can help them with that. So the construction will start later this year. It'll finish basically by December of 2011, and then by January of 2012, everything will be tested, the turbines will be running and putting the electricity into the grid. So in terms of the co-op ownership model, do you see there being an advantage in doing that, or do you see that being something that's helpful to the development of wind in Ontario?
I would think the cooperatives would be a really good model for disadvantaged or at-risk communities where they wouldn't normally, we were talking about it in the kitchen earlier. Ontario Housing and
Sure.
First Nations land, well, that's what you're doing here. But Haiti, you know, those sorts.
Funny you say that, yeah. Actually, one project you can check on the Windfall website, there's a Repower Haiti sort of proposal that our executive director and staff have been developing to basically help rebuild Haiti's electricity infrastructure using renewable energy, and small and medium enterprises getting involved with doing the development of these and feed-in tariff, right? So not trying to reinvent the wheel and not trying to have Haiti repeat the same mistakes that our society has. But in terms of housing co-ops and things like that, it's perfect synergy there. They understand the co-op model.
Because you're creating jobs too.
Especially if you're
those
talking
people
about,
who are involved in it as a cooperative, if they
For
can
sure.
get training and skills.
It's actually called Repower Haiti, and it also incorporates personal transformation. 'Cause
Cool.
again, these projects will not be successful unless there is
Yeah.
the personal dynamic and personal
Yeah.
shift that happens at the same time.
For sure.
Wow, that's interesting.
So yeah, there's already housing co-ops that have done solar projects on their roofs, and that's kind of a no-brainer for them if they can access the money, and raising money from the members of their co-op is one of the easy ways to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right.
Right.